Hello, this is Monty with Monty's Black Politics. Today I will be talking about the Reconstruction period after the African American slaves were free in January of 1863. The Reconstruction period lasted from 1863 to 1877. Today's guest is Professor Diane Anderson. Good afternoon, Professor Anderson. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you for having me.
So, before we get started, can you give us history on the Reconstruction period?
Sure. Before I get into the period of Reconstruction, I just want to give a little background regarding the Civil War, because without the Civil War, of course, there would be no Reconstruction period. The Reconstruction is a rebuilding of the country after the war. The war was fought over the issue of slavery. Those in the Confederacy wanted to secede from the Union, and they waged war to have a separate nation because they wanted to promote slavery as well as take it into any other territories that they wanted to spread out to. White Northerners fought, which was this side of the Union.
Mm-hmm.
They fought to keep the Union together, but neither one of them had any intentions on making any improvements as far as the slave population. The North, the South wanted to keep slavery. The North, their objection was to keep the Union together, but they had no intention on freeing a slave. Additionally, Lincoln insisted that the conflict was a white man's conflict,
Mm-hmm.
and what he wanted to do was to suppress the rebellious white Southerners. So his intent all along was to preserve the Union. However, during the middle of 1862, the war had been maybe like a year and a half or so. He realized that the future of the Union was tied to slavery. So then he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. And at that point, black men who weren't previously allowed to fight in the Army were enlisted into the Union Army. Now, it's important to remember that at the start of the war, it's just a side note, that African Americans actually were emancipating themselves before Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. So they began walking, they simply walked away. They took advantage of the conflict and the confusion, and they started walking away from plantations, and a lot of them followed the Union Army. So wherever the Union Army went, they went. And also, there were roughly almost 200,000 black men who served in the who served as soldiers.
And however, is that on both sides?
No, well, we're talking about the Union.
Okay.
No, so the British weren't involved in this fight. Remember, this is on American soil. It's
exactly,
the first
Civil
war that was fought on American soil. So then we have close to 200,000 soldiers and sailors. However, what we also must note is that there were women who also served the cause of the Union. Most notably, Harriet Tubman, she was a spy. Susie King Taylor was the first Army nurse, and she attended an all-black troop in South Carolina. And little-known, a woman named Cathay Williams, and she was the first African-American woman to enlist and serve in the Army. What she did was she posed as a man, and she actually fought. And without these soldiers, the efforts of these men and the women, the Union would not have won. So they won the war because of these
African Americans.
Exactly. And with that, 4 million enslaved people had been freed.
So that brings me to my next question. During the Reconstruction period, what did freedom look like for black people?
For African Americans, the first and foremost, the most important thing was for them they looked for their family members. So some of them walked to plantations. They remembered some of the places where they thought they were sold their plantations, and they walked. Some even had newspapers ads, and so it was important for them to get their families back together. We may think that even though with the advent of the domestic slave trade, that families were broken, had been torn apart, but it was very important to them because slaves did not abandon families. They still maintained families, and so it was important for them. The next thing they wanted to do was to look for land. They wanted land. They believed that after years of enslavement, that they deserved to have full citizenship and have a right to be self-sufficient by owning land. Because of course then it was very important because people were self-sustaining. They could sustain themselves by owning land because they could farm, they could sell their goods, what have you.
And have shelter.
And have shelter, and also provide for their families. Thirdly, what was also important was education. Not being able to read and write, and there were consequences for that during slavery. So the newly freed population wanted to learn after the war. It wasn't uncommon to see, once they set up schools, to see a 5-year-old and maybe a 90-year-old in the same class. Younger people were reading because for the first time they had the opportunity, and some of the older people wanted a chance to actually, read the Bible. So,
and the education was just amongst African Americans. They were not allowed to go to school with white people during that time?
No, there weren't. Schools were segregated. However, after the war, church groups set up schools. So the church was kind of the center. So the black church, some of the things that the black church provided was not only they helped people get acclimated or transition as free people. There was schools, so the black church was everything. There were, they provided shelter, clothing, so it was sort of served as a social service organization, if you will. And ex-slaves, it was interesting. One interesting fact is that black people, by 1870, they had contributed $1 million to educate themselves.
And that's just
in 1870.
That's within 7 years of being free.
Exactly. And also, they preferred black teachers because northern white teachers had imposed their cultural values on them. They didn't want the imposition of whites' cultural values, so they began to establish their own institutions.
Professor, you mentioned President Lincoln earlier. Can you explain his plan to restore the Union following the Civil War?
Okay, what he had this 3-part plan. It's called a 10% plan. So within that plan, what he wanted to do is he gave a general pardon to all Southerners except for high-ranking officials and military officials. And that plan required them to, in order to be, they would be pardoned. The next thing they had to do was to take an oath of allegiance to the Union or the United States. And also they had to recognize the emancipation of the formerly enslaved. At that point, specifically, the 13th Amendment was created. What Congress did, they appointed Oliver O. Howard to be to lead the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, the Bureau helped freedmen obtain food and medical care, land, and also they helped them establish schools as well. And they also negotiated labor contracts and settled disputes between blacks and whites.
Now, was Oliver a black man?
No, he was a Union general, and he was an Army officer and a Union general, and he was selected. He was sort of a war hero. Actually, Howard University is named after him. He founded Howard University. Actually, let me go back and talk about when we're talking about some of the things that were granted. In 1865, General William Sherman, he issued what he called a special field order number 15 in January of 1865, and that order set aside land for enslaved people, specifically along the coast of South Carolina, and in that plan it stated that each family would receive what they call possessory title of 40 acres of land and an old army mule. So governments had mules.
So that's where we get the term 40 acres and a mule.
Exactly. And they also, the Freedmen's Bureau was also responsible for allocating funds for classrooms, for African Americans or the newly emancipated to be educated. And around this time, you see the emergence of historically black colleges and universities, or HBCUs. Okay, and they were involved with basically set up approximately 3,000 schools that educated over 150,000 of the emancipated.
So going back to the 40 acres of land that the free slaves received, did they ever receive it? And
yes, for 6 months, the lands that were set aside on the coast of South Carolina. They worked the lands for 6 months. When under President Jackson's administration,
After Lincoln died.
right after Lincoln died, so he never saw the ratification of the 13th Amendment because he was assassinated shortly after. So then it was President Johnson, I think that's Johnson, but President Johnson, who actually gave amnesty, and he pardoned all the Confederate generals and high-ranking Confederates and brought them back into the Union. So one of the things that he did was he took the land back. He rescinded the order, the field order. And so there you have, and that's how African Americans who have been working this land lost it. So it's always been reported that African Americans never received the 40 acres of the Mule, but they did, but it was rescinded by
Unfortunately,
Yes.
President Johnson took it back.
Right. And even under that time, so that was the beginning of the collapse of Reconstruction. So then you have the Southern legislatures, the constitutions that they created. They had constitutional conventions, and during these conventions, blacks were admitted and they were denied equal rights. So the legislatures and these conventions, they drafted what they call black codes. And those black codes forced blacks to sign annual labor contracts after the lands were taken. And so they were basically forced to sign those with white landowners, and that returned them under black authority. So then you get the advent of sharecropping, where they were working the lands for.
And if they refused?
And if they refused, they could be arrested. Actually, there was a law that if they were not working, they could be arrested, and then they were essentially hired out to these sharecroppers to work these farms.
Now, can we go back to Congress? So during the Reconstruction period, black males were able to run for Congress. How many
Yes.
did we have during that time period?
During that time, we're talking about during Reconstruction, like between 1870 and 1871, there were 7 elected officials, 1 senator, Hiram Revels, and 7 representatives. So this came with the passing of the Voting Rights Act, giving black men, granting them the authority to vote. Okay, and white women at the time were upset about that because black men received the vote before they did.
So I remember reading that the last sitting congressperson from the Reconstruction period was 1901,
Mm-hmm.
and then in between that was 28 years before we saw another
absolutely right.
black
Right.
or African American male
Mm-hmm.
or any African American to be in Congress.
Yes.
So would you like to add anything before we conclude?
Basically, one of the things that led to when we're talking about the failure of Reconstruction, there was a lot of violence. You had the advent or the establishment of the Ku Klux Klan in 1865. Nathan Bedford in Pulaski, Tennessee, created that. And what the Klan was, it was basically a terrorist group. They wanted to disenfranchise blacks from all of the things that they had gained during Reconstruction. You know, things kind of went back, and so even though Reconstruction its intent was to improve the lives and enfranchise blacks and have civil rights and civil liberties, but the conditions it was kind of set back, and the conditions were almost as not much better than slavery, if you will, in most cases. So they were, although they were legally equal, black Americans or African Americans, or the newly emancipated, they were subject to segregation laws in the South, subjected to violence at the hands of the Ku Klux Klan, and the state constitutions disenfranchised them, and that was between 1890 and 1908. And basically, the conditions from there would not improve again until the civil rights era of the 1950s and 60s. So everything that was gained, So it was just a small amount of time or small period of time where they didn't get a chance to fully be recognized in Reconstruction.
So in your opinion, what do you think the Reconstruction period would have looked like if President Abraham Lincoln was not assassinated?
I think that it would have, I can't say that it would be successful because of the feelings of the South, because of they wanted to have their way of life. And I think he was assassinated because of that, because essentially, the Civil War did not stop Southerners from feeling like their way of life they had to have slavery, or that blacks had to be subjugated to them. That was their way of life. So I'm not sure, it might have been delayed. I think it would have been delayed had, even if Lincoln had lived. I think eventually we would still have these issues, and then some of those issues you can see vestiges of today, not only in the South, but everywhere in the country.
So, Professor Anderson, my last question for you. What factors led to the collapse of Reconstruction, and how did freedom look for Black people?
Well, it was bleak. One of the major things that occurred is that Southern whites reacted negatively because they were committed to keeping blacks in subservient positions. So they wanted the Old South. They wanted things to revert back to the way they were before emancipation. So some of the things they did, first of all, the Ku Klux Klan was established in Bedford, by General Bedford. And one of the things they wanted to do was prevent blacks from gaining any type of economic freedom, also cheap labor. They wanted to exploit them by having them, working as sharecroppers, and just basically generally taking away their rights. So in order to do that, they terrorized them. So there were hangings, lynchings, whippings, murders. So anything they could think of to keep blacks in their place. That's what they wanted to do. So even though African Americans legally had rights, they were subjected to these laws and also the violence at the hands of these white supremacy groups, and most notably the Ku Klux Klan, which was founded by a Confederate general. His name was Nathan Bedford. And actually, it was Christmas Eve of 1865.
Christmas Eve.
Right, exactly. So, but due to that, it set African Americans back, because then their conditions would not even improve again until the civil rights era. So essentially, they it almost reverted back to slavery. So they found themselves being disenfranchised. And then, when you move into the 21st century, you had Jim Crow laws. I think we mentioned that in class. And so they found themselves, fighting this battle that still, we have issues to this very day.
So now I understand why a lot of people are not educated on the Reconstruction period. It was such a short period, and it was as if everything that abolitionists and free slaves fought for, that post-Reconstruction era, made sure to revert it back to what it was.
Yes,
and they found legal ways to basically put African Americans back in slavery.
Exactly.
So
well, it's not in slavery per se, but not much better. They didn't fare much better, except for it was, they actually were in chains. So they didn't fare much better. So it almost went back to that I think we talked about the advent of sharecropping and what have you. So, yeah.
Well, Professor Anderson, I want to thank you for being a guest on the show, and you have a great evening.
Thank you.